Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event series at UNC-Chapel Hill. It is great to see such a good and large online audience today. And today, our event comes from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Our distinguished guest today is Robert Zoellick. Bob Zoellick doesn't really need an introduction. However, I will introduce him to you in a minute anyway. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richland Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at UNC-Chapel Hill. At present, I'm a Global Europe and Kissinger China Institute Fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. We are all deeply shocked by the current turmoil and violence in the world around us. There are the terrible wars in Israel and Ukraine, and there are many other potential trouble spots which could explode at any minute. Is America still the indispensable nation which Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright called the United States? What is America's role in the world today, and what was America's role in the past? Bob Zoellick will help us to explore these and many other questions. Bob Zoellick is one of the nation's most well-known geopolitical and economic thinkers. Only yesterday, someone told me that whenever he encountered Bob at a professional meeting, Bob Zoellick was the smartest person in the room. Bob has had many distinguished and influential positions in the world of diplomacy, politics, and economics. For instance, in the later 1980s, Bob held various positions in the US Treasury Department. During the George H.W. Bush administration, he worked as Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the State Department. And he also led the US delegation to the 2+4 talks on German unification. In the early 1990s, Bob Zoellick was James Baker's Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House. And during President George W. Bush's first term, Bob Zoellick was US Trade Representative. Among many other things, during this time, he completed China's and Taiwan's entry into the World Trade Organization. From 2005 to 2006, Bob was US Deputy Secretary of State. During this time, he again dealt a lot with US policy toward China. Well known, for example, is Bob's speech in 2005, in which he admonished Beijing to become a responsible stakeholder in global affairs. But Bob Zoellick also was a leading voice in the Darfur peace process and helped negotiate the peace accord between the government of Sudan and the Sudan Liberation Army. Between 2007 and 2012, Bob Zoellick was the 11th president of the World Bank. His tenure was made quite difficult by the Great Recession and the global financial crisis of the years of 2008 and 2009. Still, the Financial Times also credited him with addressing climate change and the problems of developing countries during his time as World Bank president. And in 2012, Bob Zoellick supported Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, and he was talked about as a Secretary of State if Romney had defeated Obama. In the following years, Bob Zoellick was chairman of the International Advisors to Goldman Sachs, and he is now a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. And in 2016, Bob was perhaps the highest-ranking Republican to sign a Never Trump letter. I don't want to list all the many awards and honors Bob has received, but I would like to mention Bob Zoellick's superb 2020 book entitled America and the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And if you haven't read it, it's still worth reading. Please go and get it. And before I pepper Bob Zoellick with some questions, let me just point out that, as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again and again and again. And the address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Today, our Krasno assistant is Daniela Siglioni of the Wilson Center, and she will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Bob Zoellick, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. How are you?
Well, thank you, Klaus, and happy Halloween. I had a feeling you were doing a memorial event for me there with that introduction. But I know for German Lutherans, this is an important time because it's the eve of the night that the 95 Theses were on the church door of Wittenberg. So
That's very true, but Halloween is much more celebrated in the United States than it is in Germany or in other European countries. But let me ask you straight away. In your book, America and the World, you write that the United States is an exceptional, ongoing experiment, both at home and in international relations, that should serve a larger purpose. Is this still your view? Is the United States still exceptional? Is that why you wrote your book about American diplomatic history?
Well, let me start, Klaus, by explaining a little bit, as you mentioned, why I wrote the book, and then I'll try to turn to your question. So when I was in government or at the World Bank, I often drew upon history when I was dealing with problems. And I wanted to share that approach with other people, particularly a younger generation that's thinking about foreign policy. As you and many in the audience will know, Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy, where he used history to explain foreign policy. But given Dr. Kissinger's inclinations, it reflected more of a European realpolitik perspective. And I wanted to write about the American ideas and perspective. And I suppose there was one other dimension, which in those various jobs you listed, I often had younger assistants. And because I liked history, I would often ask them questions. I was asking you about your students. I have no idea what students learn these days. But what I discovered is that insofar as they had read about history, it tended to be World War II and beyond. And in the case of the United States, the first 150 years are quite fascinating, and there's some very interesting sort of people and events that I think one can learn from. And many universities these days tend to teach foreign policy using international relations theory. Maybe you encounter this at North Carolina. And while international relations theory is fun to debate and has some intellectual challenge, I found it to be not terribly useful when I was dealing with German unification or Sudan or sort of other issues. So the approach that I've tried to take is to use stories. In effect, I've written multiple biographies about different people and the problems of their eras. And starting with Ben Franklin and our revolution, and going on to Lincoln and Seward keeping out foreign intervention in our Civil War, the Louisiana Purchase, and of course, the 20th century items, all the way up to Bush 41, and then I have an afterword with some of the later periods. As for your point about exceptional, I don't use, I used an exceptional past, but the way I talked about the theme is I refer to as America's purpose. And I realize exceptionalism is a loaded word for different people feeling that their countries, of course, have exceptional backgrounds. And in the US context, what I was trying to explain is, while like other countries, we've had a focus on geography, North America, our relations across the Pacific. We've had a particular interest in trade and economics and transnationalism, a switch on alliances. So we were anti-alliances until World War II and thereafter, and now we build a system based on alliances. And because we, of course, have domestic politics, which I think is important in anybody's foreign policy. But there's an aspect that shows up quite early in the American experience about a larger purpose. And so for those of you that still carry money, at someday, take a look at the back of a dollar bill. You'll see what is this Great Seal of the United States. And maybe you've never looked at it closely, but you'll see this unfinished pyramid. Notice it's unfinished with the Eye of Providence above it, and it's Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. And in my research, I found that at the time that that seal was created, the founders of the United States were thinking in bigger terms. They were thinking about a larger order of the ages. And of course, the purpose changes. So in the early period, it was simply to preserve a republic in the world of empires. For Lincoln, it was the last best hope of trying to keep the Union together in avoiding a civil war. For Woodrow Wilson, it was to make the world safe for democracy. It wasn't to make the world into democracies, it was to make it safe for democracies. For Franklin Roosevelt, it was the four freedoms. In the Cold War, as the leader of the free world, or as you mentioned with Madeleine Albright, the indispensable power. So my point is that to understand US foreign policy, while there are aspects of US idealism that fit into this, there's an ebb and flow about the purpose. And I think this era is a particularly interesting one because I think there's an unsettled view of America's purpose. You can see this in the debate going on about Ukraine. To what degree should we provide resources? You see it with China and Taiwan. You see it with the Middle East. And so the reason I emphasize that theme is not to pat the United States on its back with some sort of larger achievement. It's more to recognize that that's an idea that influences the making of foreign policy.
Thank you. When you look back at your own manifold jobs in politics, were there any concrete examples when you used history in your practical policy making? A lot of people use always the Munich analogy and appeasement for explaining current affairs, like we have to be tough, we shouldn't give in to dictators. But that's a very simple analogy. I'm sure yours have been much better. So what kind of historical events did you use?
Well, you and I were discussing this. As you and I both know, people often use analogies. I think that's often a risky business. So the other big one is Vietnam and quagmire. So you've got appeasement and quagmires. Ernest May wrote a book with Richard Neustadt in the 1980s called Thinking in Time. And the book's a little dense, but it's got some very good insights. One of the major ones is to draw upon history in asking questions. So when I think about history and policy making, one starts with the logical question of what's been tried before and what worked and what didn't work. What people are involved and what are their backgrounds? What nations are involved? What are their backgrounds? What processes and institutions are involved and what are their backgrounds? And importantly, try to understand how other people think about their history. So to bring this in practical terms, you're originally from Germany, so I'll give an example from 1989-90. As you know, many of the early historical works about the end of the Cold War in Europe focused on Gorbachev and Russia. And not surprisingly, some of them, like an autobiography written by Jack Matlock, the US ambassador in Moscow, stressed that the US should have done more for Gorbachev earlier on. What a lot of those histories miss is that in 1989 and 90, the United States was focused first on the German question as opposed to the Russia question. And what I mean by the German question is that up till 1871, the German question was a series of small German states dominated by its neighbors. After 1871, the story is, how do you deal with a united Germany, the most powerful state in Europe, without natural borders? And we go through 2 world wars, and the solution after 1945 is 2 German states, or 3 if you include Austria. And so one of our concerns in 1989-90 was to fulfill our commitment to the German people about unification. And we believed that a German democracy would do this, but we wanted to do so in a way that addressed this anxiety that was very much present in Europe, with Britain and France and many other neighbors, certainly for the Soviets. And that was to have unification occur within the Western structures that we created over 40 years. NATO, the EC becoming the European Union. We also talked about changing the nature of CSCE. And this even fit within the logic of a Europe whole and free, which President Bush talked about at the time. And so in early 1989, with some of the issues of the appeal of Gorbachev to the German people, we had this very complex issue of short-range nuclear missiles and the elimination of them, nuclear missiles everywhere but in Germany. So as one German politician said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. And so we had to we came up with an innovative conventional forces proposal, which people have almost totally forgotten, which was quite important in sort of reshaping the landscape. But so that's an interesting example of how one had to have some sense of European history. And for us, the importance of dealing with Germany first as an ally. But to take another.
Yeah, thank you, Len, because I have to ask you here, because talking about James Baker and German unification, did James Baker promise Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward, that, all that which led to Putin's calling the downfall of the Soviet Union one of the greatest geopolitical disasters of the recent past?
No, this has been a well-researched issue, but let me sort of explain the result and where I think the confusion comes from. The result, if you go back and you look at the 2+4 agreement, which was the final settlement for German unification, there are special provisions for the former Eastern states, the Eastern Länder. There were limitations on non-German NATO forces and other arrangements. Those were negotiated. You'll find nothing in the agreement about not enlarging NATO. And for anybody who dealt with Soviet or Russian diplomacy, I have to smile when people say, oh yes, they would have relied on an oral statement and not gotten it in writing. That doesn't fit my experience with the Russians or the Soviets. A second aspect, though, quite important, was that Gorbachev first acknowledges the idea of a united Germany and NATO in the spring of 1990 in a meeting in Washington with Bush. And I had a role in this because I had discovered that under CSCE principles, these are the Helsinki principles, which Gorbachev very much admired. One of the principles was that countries should have the right to choose their own alliance. And so President Bush says to Gorbachev, look, we believe Germany should be in NATO. You may have a different view, but can we agree on the principle of countries choosing their own alliance? And Gorbachev says, yes, which was a big shock to his delegation. Well, if that applied to Germany, wouldn't it apply to others? Another part of it is, frankly, Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, and Kozyrev, who was then later the Russian foreign minister, both say there was sort of no commitment not to enlarge NATO. And frankly, when NATO does start to expand in the mid-90s, Wolfgang Ischinger, a former German diplomat, explained to me that the Russians didn't even raise the issue. And if they, obviously there'd been a commitment, they would have done so. Now, what did happen? Well, what happened was that in early 1990, and we have to recall, events were moving quite quickly. Baker goes to Moscow. At this point, we were trying to create the 2+4 process as a way of doing the negotiation. But Baker's also trying to persuade Gorbachev to consider the idea of a united Germany NATO as opposed to a united Germany that would be a new Mitteleuropa, unconnected to any alliance. It goes right back to the strategic and historic point I mentioned. And he says, as a hypothetical, would you prefer Germany to be united in NATO without the jurisdiction one step further east, or to be an independent power? Now, Baker quickly corrected himself within days by using the word jurisdiction, because that would be a legal term. And instead, he then said, what we should try to do is have a special status. And that's what actually does show up in the treaty. That's where the confusion arises. But so it's a hypothetical. The Soviets never sort of jump and say, oh, yes, let's accept these terms. You have the further explanation. And not surprisingly, what you should look at is what the agreements that are eventually struck. And to give you one more little insight on this, Klaus, I was in Moscow on the night before the final settlement agreement. As you may recall, there was actually a dispute Germans are very anxious about what would be the position of non-German NATO forces in the Eastern Länder. They couldn't be stationed there, and there were sort of limits on sort of deployments. And I was thinking at the table that we didn't want to have a total restriction, because I was imagining that someday Poland may want to come into NATO and you want to have the ability to move forces through Germany to Poland. I obviously didn't throw that out for debate at the table, but it was in my mind. And as you may know, the last night, then we worked out a special note that says the definitions will be determined by Germany as a sovereign state, and it's a separate signed agreement. So that was the history of this. And I think anyone who's seen Putin and his behavior has to realize this is part of his effort to try to manipulate public opinion for Russia. That's a separate question about how far you should enlarge NATO, and that's a different sort of policy.
Let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that, because that is, of course, one of the reasons many people say, including Putin and the Russians, that NATO expansion was the reason why he had to, in inverted commas, or had no choice to attack Ukraine. Many people, of course, dispute it, say that NATO expansion had nothing whatsoever to do with it. What is your view?
I don't think Poland or the Baltics threaten Moscow. And I think it's a ridiculous idea that they would. In fact, I think for the early stages of NATO enlargement, it goes right back to this historical question. I remember when I was in college, I read a book called The Lands Between. It was a book about Eastern Europe by a British historian, I think Alan Palmer. And part of the story about Central and Eastern Europe, as you would know, was the anxieties caught by smaller states between two big powers, Germany and Russia. And so, in my view, in our own strategic view, was that we wanted to try to avoid a revival of those old tensions. Look at what's just happened in Polish politics in the Polish election. Think of what the anxieties that would be going on in Poland if you didn't have the reassurance of Poland being in the EU and NATO. So I think, and I think, frankly, democratic, peacemaking countries on Russia's border don't hurt Russia. It's a question of Russia's own politics. I think in the case of Ukraine, we come into a different issue. And the first part of it is, I think the 2008 decision by NATO to suggest that Ukraine could come in without bringing Ukraine in was the worst of all worlds, because it raised the anxieties without necessarily making the security commitment. And my own view is that NATO is a defense alliance, not just a security alliance. And I don't think we should bring countries in unless we're willing to defend them. And that you see that right now. We're willing to help give military resources and some economic resources, but I don't think Americans are willing to fight for Ukraine. I don't think Germans are willing to fight for Ukraine. So there are natures of security relations here, and I'm a big supporter of what's going on, our support for Ukraine. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in NATO's alliance. But let's come back to the history question with Putin. I think to understand Putin's war on Ukraine, you have to understand Putin and his view of Russian history and his place in Russian history. Lavrov, the foreign minister, is not a man I would normally quote, but he had a good line when asked about who Putin consults. He said, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. So, and I think for Putin, he, of course, believes Ukraine has never been a sovereign state. The Rus started in Kiev. He believes this is part of the Russian heartland. He's critical of Lenin for making it a republic in 1921, 1922. And as he got older and he realized that the effort that he started in 2014 to take away part of Ukraine and take away Crimea, that you still saw Ukraine moving to the West, I think he felt time was running out and he wanted to secure his place in history by conquering what he thought was part of the Russian heartland. There's a telling anecdote. Bill Burns, our CIA director, used to be a colleague of mine at the State Department, had been our ambassador in Russia, knew Putin quite well. Biden sends Bill to see Putin late in November before the invasion. And Putin says to Bill Burns, Bill, he said, what choice do I have? Well, of course, he has plenty of choices. But what he's saying is, Ukraine is moving west. He wants to dominate it. And I think after failing to conquer Ukraine, his view is, if I can't have it, no one will have it. And again, this is where the issue of understanding how other people view their history or perspective on history is quite important. Putin gives a speech in St. Petersburg during the war. It's quite bizarre to Western ears. He says, look, this land used to be occupied by the Swedes, but Peter the Great took it. It took 20 years for people to accept it's Russian land, but this is part of our heartland. This is how Putin thinks. And the reason this is important is that I think he's going to double down. I think this is now a war of attrition, a stalemate. And I think it's important as a policy matter that we not only support Ukrainians militarily, but I and others have also been talking about the transferring of Russian reserves to Ukraine to help them survive economically. So it's a good example of how history can inform both one's own policy making and understanding how other people think.
Two brief questions about that. You said that Putin was afraid that Ukraine was moving westward. So does that mean he was actually more afraid of the influence of the European Union, its economic power, but also its cultural, normative power, than he was afraid of NATO expansion? And as you rightly said, the Baltic states had become a member of NATO a long time ago and never did do anything aggressive against Russia.
I think it's a variation on your European thesis. I think it's that if Ukraine succeeded as a democracy and as a sovereign independent state and moved towards a society that was a successful economy and democracy, this would undermine the nature of his rule. But I think it goes back to this rather primal view of what he believes sort of the Russian land is about. Look, it's often useful to look at the statements that these leaders actually make. In his case, he often writes it himself. So as you know, from many Americans don't have the sense of the Russian view of history, there's a school of thought in Russia that Russia is, in a sense, the buffer between the Asian masses and the European dangers. And so it had to intervene against Napoleon or Hitler to save Europe from itself, but it also stops the Mongolian hordes from coming in. And it's a unique culture and system. That's partly the view that he reflects. And for him, Ukraine is part of the Russian heartland.
In 2008, when that promise was made to Ukraine, but also to Georgia, for example, that eventually they would become members of NATO, you were in government. It was, so to speak, your president who took that decision. Was there a debate going on within the Bush administration? Were you involved in that debate? And what led to that decision to offer NATO membership, in theory, at least, to Ukraine, Georgia, and others?
I had left the government 2 years before. And so I went to the World Bank in 2007. So it wasn't at that time. I understand that there was a debate, but the president decided on the course that he did. And I don't think it was the wisest course.
Mm-hmm. And when you now look at Russia, Ukraine, and the war, is there a chance that it can be overcome, or does one have to defeat Russia before in order to liberate the Ukrainian territories or conquered by Russia?
You use the word defeat, and since the war began, I've been pressing people in government in Europe or the United States to say, well, what does it mean to have a victory or a defeat? And in my terms, what a victory would amount to would be a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine that has its connections with the West, I hope as a member of the European Union, that has the different types of security without necessarily being a NATO member, but the type of support. Now notice what I'm including and I'm not including. I'm not talking about the exact territory. To me, the strategic success would be a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine that sort of succeeds. This is important because in the start, of course, Europeans and Americans, understandably were impressed with the courage and fortitude of Ukrainian people, and they didn't want to, they said, oh, this is Ukraine's choice. Well, it's Ukraine's choice, but it's also at the end of the day, the rest of ours. And I think at some point, we're going to find that unless the Ukrainians have a breakthrough, we're going to be in a war of attrition. And then how do we help create the success that I described for the Ukrainian state, which is a combination of security and economics? As for Putin, I don't think he's going to relent at least through the 2024 election because he wants to see if Trump is elected. And after that point, it depends on circumstances. I mean, as you saw with Prigozhin, sometimes the opaqueness of Russian society has its own weaknesses. It may depend on the role that China plays. So I wouldn't underestimate the strength of the Putin-Xi relationship. But if there's one country that might lean into Putin at the appropriate point and say, well, let's try to reach some settlement here, my guess is that China would be the best candidate. I'm not saying it will happen. And again, to connect this back to foreign policy, this is a point I just actually made with a Chinese official recently. I don't understand China's position from its own point of national interest, in that China traditionally supports territorial integrity. So why would it support taking apart Ukraine? Second, China doesn't like US alliances. I do, but I understand they don't. Well, they've just strengthened US alliances, not only with Finland and Sweden and NATO, but frankly, the connections with the Pacific allies. Third, China wants to have a good relationship with Europe. And this attack has clearly undermined European confidence in Chinese policy and frightened about their support for Putin. And fourth, China's got some economic issues. I don't see its interest in having destabilized oil prices or food prices or other issues. What undercuts this is the Putin-Xi relationship. I think Putin, in his own weakness, has played this rather shrewdly. I think he's said to Xi, look, if I go, you'll be undermined, you'll be left alone. But I think part of US and European diplomacy should be to try to persuade the Chinese, in their own interest, to press Putin to reach some settlement at some point.
I couldn't agree more, but more about China in a minute. You said that Ukraine may have to give up some of the territories in order to become a democratic, sovereign, Western integrated country. Could the United States lean on Ukraine to give up Crimea, to give up the 4 territories annexed by Putin a short while ago?
This is a fluid situation. And when you're conducting diplomacy, you really have to have your Fingerspitzengefühl, your fingertip feel for what's going on the ground. I would say that ultimately Ukrainians have to come to this decision themselves in concert with their partners. And we'll see what happens over the next months and what would be accepted. Frankly, trying to recover those eastern territories would be in some ways a poison chalice. They're pretty heavily destructed. I can understand strategically the Ukrainian drive towards the Black Sea. They want to preserve their access to the Black Sea and how Russia has cut it off. So those are the fluid aspects where the battlefield would interconnect with diplomacy.
When you look at Congress, when you look at the American population and the rise of perhaps a new isolationism, are you optimistic that American support for Ukraine will continue, or are you doubtful?
I never take any support for granted, particularly in a politically fluid time like this. If you actually look at the votes, about 2/3 of the members of the House have been supportive, the Senate sort of even more so, but we've gone through this rather bizarre change of leadership in the House, and that will have to work its way through. If I were to place a bet, Klaus, based on sort of my political experience, I would bet that by the end of the year, you'll see a supplemental bill that will help Ukraine, that will help Taiwan, that will help some border issues, some other issues about natural disasters. That would be my bet. But coming back to this issue of transferring the Russian reserves, one reason why Larry Summers and Phil Zellico and I have been pushing this is I don't think it's very likely that Americans or Europeans are going to want to give that money back to Russia. We believe there's a very good legal argument under international law to be able to have, under countermeasures, a transfer to Ukraine. And frankly, I think one of the things that's holding it up is some of the German companies believe that there's still a possibility of return to old days with Russia, which I don't think is realistic. But what I would even suggest for that is, so let's set up a claims process, as was done after the Gulf War, where if Russians take some German firms, then the German companies can seek claims from some of that amount. So we can deal with the politics of that. And frankly, I do the same thing with some of the developing countries that have been hurt by food and energy prices. After the first Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqi reserves that had been held in the US, Britain, and France were put in an escrow account. And there were over 20 claimants. Kuwait obviously got the major share, but I think there were 12 countries that got some claims on this. So this is a good example of how we have to keep international law fresh and adapt, because the war and attrition will require an economic response as much as a military one. And going to your political question, I think there's stronger support in the United States for military support for Ukraine than economic support. And unless the Europeans want to handle all this themselves, I would suggest they start to look at this issue of transferring the Russian reserves, which, by the way, I think they are. Von der Leyen and others are moving in that direction. A few member states and their lawyers, including Germany, have been, I think, the most cautious.
There's a lot of concern in the American public, if I read it correctly, about the rising debt of the United States, which also then contributes to the high rate of inflation. Are you, as an economist, as a former president of the World Bank, are you concerned about the financial situation of the United States, or can that continue indefinitely because the United States has the dollar as a reserve currency?
So Herb Stein, who was an economist in the 80s, had a very wise comment. He said, if something can no longer continue, it will stop. But the short answer to your question is, yes, I'm actually quite concerned. And that's one reason that I'm more critical of some of the Biden administration's industrial policies, because this year our deficit, which is still a year of reasonable growth, should be about 7.5% to 8% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office estimates at least 5% a year for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years. And frankly, that's probably an underestimate. The US deficit as a percentage of GDP is, I think, about 96, 98%. The highest level was 106% in 1946, right after World War II. And I think within by maybe 2028, the estimate of our debt service, the interest to pay the debt, will be equal to the defense budget. So I'm actually not worried about the dollar in general, because I think it's always a question of what the alternative will be. And I don't think people want to hold renminbi. And if you look at the overall reserve balance over time, the dollars remain strong with the euro. There's been some movement away from the dollar to Australia, Canada, Switzerland, but there's still the G7 currencies. I think the greatest risk is the one you mentioned, which is the United States at some point is going to have to be careful about its rising debt and deficits. Can I just mention one other example, because you're from Europe and we're talking about the European side, but I want to emphasize one other aspect from my experience real quickly. In the same 91-92 period, we had the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the reason I want to draw attention to that is that in the idea of drawing upon history, this was much more than a free trade agreement. For people that understand American history, they know that in the Mexican-American War of 1846-47, Mexico lost about 1/3 to 1/2 of its territory. And the Mexican view of the United States for generations was, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. So when President Salinas proposed the idea of a North American Free Trade Agreement, and I was working with Secretary Baker and President Bush, very much pushed this idea because it was more than trade and integration. It was an idea of a reconciliation. And combined with it was the fact that the PRI, the ruling party in Mexico, that really came from a corporatist movement of Europe in the 20s and 30s, was breaking down. And the old hierarchies of the system were going to have to reattach, whether with oligarchs or corruption or others. And we've seen that process play out. So it's in our own interest to try to make sure that Mexican democracy is linked with that of Canada and the United States. So that's another example of thinking about history when you're dealing with current policy.
Thank you. The war in Ukraine is terrible enough. Now we have the Middle East exploding as well. Is Israel's response to these terrible attacks by Hamas proportional?
Well, again, I would start with this one, Klaus, with a historical perspective. As you know, you can't begin to understand the Israeli response without understanding the people that came from the Holocaust. And the Israeli view is they are vulnerable, they are alone. On top of that, it often helps to visit Israel and have a sense of the geography because it's a very small place. There's no sense of depth in it. And I think one of the failures of intelligence and the military in the first hours of the Hamas attack was that one Israeli said to me, look, we didn't just have fear, but we actually felt helpless. And as you know, for the Israeli psychology, a sense of helplessness runs very, very deep in the anxieties. So it's not surprising that you would have a feeling on Israel that they want to strike back. I think the question is, what does it mean to destroy Hamas? What does it mean to reestablish deterrence? And this is obviously part of the debate about what military operations have to be combined with the humanitarian side. And a bigger way to say it is what will be the political objectives along with the military objectives. And to connect this to US policy, I compliment President Biden because I think his response in Israel probably made him the most popular politician in Israel because of his empathy. And then the question is, based on that, might he be able to nudge Israeli policy for a political objective that is longer lasting than the military one? Having said this, there's deep, deep historical feelings on all sides. So, as you know, neither Egyptians nor Jordanians want to take the Palestinians. And part of this goes back to the deep historical sort of fears that coming out of the fact of Palestinians sort of being pushed out in late 1940s and 50s at the time of independence. So history runs very, very deep in the Middle East. And I think the question will be, as we've seen sometimes in the past, as we saw after 1973, and we've seen, frankly, after the Gulf War, there is an opportunity to shift around the chess pieces on the board and restart diplomacy. And I think that's still a long shot in the present environment, but it's something worth contemplating. To make it work, you do need a Palestinian partner. That clearly will not be Hamas. And I think one of the other problems will be the Palestinian Authority doesn't really have legitimacy internally or externally. So I was saying to you, when I was with the World Bank, I worked with Salam Fayyad, who was trying to help build the institutions, help sort of create a sense of empowerment. And he was kind of pressed aside as prime minister by the sort of leadership of the Palestinian Authority. Maybe you will find a new generation of leaders in the Palestinian Authority that can be backed by the Saudis and others, sort of to create an opportunity for a two-state solution.
When you look at what is happening in the Middle East, do you expect an enlargement of the conflict, that more and more countries get involved, including then also the West Bank, maybe Syria? The Houthis have now fired missiles from Yemen, I hear. Then, of course, southern Lebanon is a trouble spot and may explode. Would that not really lead to a world war in the end?
I think there are serious risks of escalation, and you've ticked off the parts, starting with the West Bank, with Hezbollah and Lebanon, with Iran. As a student of events, I would just say that so far, I think you've seen in the case of Hezbollah and the Israelis, responses that are sort of fitting within what we might call a very crude set of rules. In other words, Hezbollah has not fired the rockets deeply into Israel. Israel's response has been somewhat measured. They're both signaling their desire not to escalate. The United States sending 2 carrier groups to the region is also a signal to Iran and others not to escalate. The Iranians have their own internal problems, obviously, and so how much do they want to, in a sense, run the risk when Hamas is doing a lot of the dirty work for them? So I don't mean to be sanguine about it. I think this is an issue one has to be careful about, but I'm hopeful that it won't escalate. But, you know, as you know, when wars are unleashed, they lead to unpredictable events, and that you just can't.
I also fear that the ruthless way, it seems, how civilians are being dealt with right now in the Gaza Strip, that will lead to an enormous backlash against Israel, but also against the United States and the entire Western world. Look already what is happening in the so-called global South regarding Ukraine, Russia, where many countries inexplicably to the Western world seem to side with Russia. Will that not also lead to people in the global South siding with the Palestinians, and not just the civilians, but Hamas?
Well, there's no doubt we're in a propaganda war. You started out with the effect on the civilians in Gaza. You might have started out with the effect on the civilians in Israel. The attack, as I recall, was launched by Hamas.
Absolutely.
And I don't think Hamas cares at all about protecting the Palestinians. They're in their caves. They're not protecting the Palestinian people. That doesn't mean that Israel can ignore it. But I think, you know, one has to be have an honest sense here that in a propaganda war, both sides will try to play their hands. And in this case, the danger is always that, the lie will be halfway around the world before the truth comes back. So you saw this in the alleged Israeli missile attack that turned out to be a Hamas missile instead. So this will be part of the challenge for Israel and the United States, is to make the counterpoint. But again, anybody who's dealt with the Middle East know that you have to, this is a cold and tough part of the world. The Egyptians and Jordanians don't want the Palestinians either. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, what does Saudi Arabia want? Saudi Arabia wants its own growth strategy. It's just had the Davos in the desert. So I think to try to bring this back to a diplomatic issue, you have to ask yourself, how will action serve your strategic objectives? So from Hamas's point of view, they've been successful in showing their resistance. They probably undermined a reconciliation between Israel and the Saudis. For Iran, it's a mixed question because they've supported these militias in different parts of the world, but this could also increase their vulnerability over time. And I think this goes back to the issue for Israel, the United States, and others about the need to come up with a political strategy that matches the military strategy. You mentioned the so-called global south. Like you, I sometimes use that word, but I always cringe because the developing world, in my experience, is pretty different. There's a lot of variation over the world. But in showing some response to that, you remember when we talked about Russian reserves for Ukraine, and you recall I suggested one option would be to create a claims process for some of the developing countries hurt by food and energy prices. That, in my view, is a good practical example of trying to deal with some of the developing countries' anxieties of the war in a way that broadens your coalition and supports them. So it's the essence of the pragmatism that I talk about in the book.
Thank you. We talk about China and the potential role China would have in helping to resolve the Ukraine war. What about China in the Middle East? Does China have an important role to play in the Middle East to overcome this terrible problem?
It might, and it's a point that I've actually made to Chinese officials recently. And let me give you the context. China is a much larger user of energy supplies from the Middle East and Gulf than the United States. It has an interest in energy security. And going back to 2005 and 6, when I was in the State Department, I remember visiting then Premier Wen Jiabao in preparation for President Hu's trip to see President Bush. And I had given a speech in 2005 that you mentioned about China as a responsible stakeholder and trying to look at its systemic interest in the system. And in a rather flattering way, Wen Jiabao was responding to my speech. He just wanted to talk about my speech. But I wanted to alert him to the fact that we needed to discuss Iran and North Korea and other issues. And so as I got into the car, a Chinese vice minister pulls me aside and says, "Look, Bob, we got the message about Iran." He said, "But we have 3 issues. Number 1, of course, we can't do exactly what you do. We have to be a little different. Number 2, we have interests in Iran. And 3, the Iranians are a little crazy. We don't know what they'll do." And so I stopped the car and I said, this is exactly the type of conversation that I wanted to get us going with. Because while I appreciate your interest in trying to support and work with the US, let's think about this from Chinese interests. What will it do to your energy security if a country that denies the Holocaust and Israel's right to exist gets nuclear weapons in the Middle East? How does that affect your interest? And to a degree, that still plays out today. Now, China is not going to side with the US or Israel on this issue. But might it lean into Iran and sort of urge it not to escalate? Yes, I think that's possible. So it's a good example, just as we talked about with Russia, where at the biggest strategic level, Klaus, Russia is a spoiler. Russia is a country that has huge demographic problems. I think Putin lives in the past. He's trying to break apart the system. Frankly, Europeans should be alerted to the danger on their border, and the holiday with history that started at the end of the Cold War is over for Europe. At the same time, I think Iran is a very odd theocracy that also wants to undermine the system. China's not exactly the same. China benefits from the international order. It wants more power. It wants more influence. It doesn't want to be threatened in its way. But I think there are possibilities to work with China on security issues, on economic issues, on climate issues, and others. Right now, our relations with China, in part for reasons on both sides, reflect a lack of trust, and one has to see how you can rebuild that.
But at the moment, I think there is a thaw going on in China's relations with both the United States and Europe. We are hearing about the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping in November in San Francisco, which may probably materialize. So things are looking up, or are they not?
I think there had been a downward spiral that got increasingly dangerous. And I think President Biden recognized this. And so he wanted to put a floor under the spiral. And the various meetings of the US ministers going to China are in an effort to have those discussions. I think that's a good thing. I think as a hard-headed analyst, I'm not sure that those discussions are very substantive yet. And it goes back to the politics in both countries. Look, I got to know Xi Jinping when he was party secretary in Hangzhou, and I was at the State Department. I later actually stayed at his compound. We had a long conversation. I talked to him as vice president. When he became general secretary in 2012, I was just leaving the World Bank. And the World Bank had done this study with the Chinese about the next stage of Chinese reforms. It was called China 2030. So I asked President Xi, what are your priorities for development? And I'll always remember his answer he said the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And that number would probably be about 100 million today. But the point was, Klaus, I had dealt with lots of heads of government asking about economics. Not one, if I'd asked them about their priorities, would have given me their party membership. And that was a clue as to what Xi Jinping was about. On the US side, I think the Biden administration, in part because it didn't want to look soft on China, said that engagement with China had failed. Well, engagement with China hadn't failed. It accomplished a lot of things, but there was always things more to be done. And so now the administration finds itself with the challenge of how do we re-engage? And in part, as you know, the mood in the United States, particularly in Washington, is quite confrontational towards China. So they're worried about this effect in the election. So in sum, I think that things have, on both sides, have gotten quite contentious. But I do think that the steps over the past months are in the right direction. I'm somewhat cautious as to have high expectations. But these issues that we've talked about would be good examples. If China could help keep Iran out, if China could help push Putin towards a solution, those would obviously be well received by the US and Europe.
Mm-hmm. The Chinese economy is not doing too well, to put it kindly, right now. Is that just a temporary thing, or do you expect that will last for quite some time?
I think there are some serious difficulties. There's sort of two theses discussed most often in the United States, and they actually, they can be aligned together. One is a structural one, which is if you look at the structure of Chinese economic development, it's relied very heavily on investment, infrastructure, repressed savings, export-led growth. Consumption as a percentage of GDP is about 38%, where in the US it's about 70%. Most European countries would be similar. So China's growth model has somewhat run its course. You can only build so many bridges and expressways and other aspects. And that will be a structural challenge for China to change because it needs to rely more on domestic consumption and growth. The other thesis, which is, I think, complementary in some ways, is that Xi Jinping has clearly consolidated power. The system that he inherited going back to Deng Xiaoping had involved term limits, it involved some balance among the different factions in the Chinese party, it involved collective leadership. It's all now centralized under Xi Jinping. My own view is those centralized systems create danger, lack of information, and I think that you can see the effect on confidence in the private sector. You can see the effect on increased savings in part because people are uncertain of the future. And so that is aspect of the Chinese authoritarian system that adds to the structural problems. Having said that, Klaus, I don't think the Chinese economy is going to collapse. I think it still can have reasonable growth. It has a lot of inherent strengths. The technocrats are very good, but I think it's going to be in a troubled period. And I think the types of raids that you see on business firms where people can't have information are going to make it harder. I was in Berlin earlier this year, and I remember talking to one of the senior executives with the BDI, the German Business Association, saying that 20 years ago, an up-and-coming German executive would have loved to go to Shanghai. He said, now it's not a posting that you want. And I think that's true with all businesses, and that's obviously going to hurt the foreign investment and knowledge that China needs to be part of the international economy.
A last question on China, because I think a lot of people are worried about a war with China. Even American military leaders have said in a few years' time, and they've given a precise date even, there will be war over Taiwan, war in the South China Sea. How dangerous is it to say something like that? How realistic is it?
Well, our CIA director, Bill Burns, who I mentioned, has said that Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be prepared by 2027. That's not the same as going to war. As for generals and admirals saying that there will be war by a certain point, I think they're out of their lane. I don't think they should be doing that. That's not their responsibility. That's the role of political leaders in a democracy. It's their job to prepare for contingencies. Having said that, I think that there are risks that are primarily centered around Taiwan. I don't think either side wants a conflict in Taiwan. We're going to face elections in Taiwan in the first part of 2024. I don't think any communist leader of China could accept an independent Taiwan that moves towards independence. The public in Taiwan is deeply ambivalent. I don't think they want independence. They'd like to maintain the status quo. But no doubt it's a risky environment. But this goes back a little bit to our initial discussion of history. People have to recognize that China lost Taiwan to Japan after the 1894-1895 war, the Sino-Japanese War. And so in the Chinese mind, this is the restoration of Chinese territory going back to the Opium Wars in the 1840s and the century of humiliation, as Xi Jinping would say it. So one needs to recognize that while I hope we can maintain the status quo, and in my career, I helped, as you mentioned, both Taiwan and China come into the WTO, helped them both come into APEC, helped Taiwan get in the World Health Assembly for a while. I think it's in our interest to try to dampen the risks of conflict, which would be much more earth-shaking than the ones we're dealing with now.
Thank you. We have to turn to our audience in a minute and get some questions from the audience. The final question, talk about transatlantic relations. What is the state of the transatlantic relationship right now? It seems to me that ever since Russia's attack on Ukraine, there's been a so-called new harmony in transatlantic relations. But will that last? Is that a genuine harmony, or are there structural problems which will break out again?
Well, I think one has to look at events within a stream of recent history. I think Trump's transactionalism scared the living daylights out of the Europeans, as it should have. And I think Biden, by nature, wanted to try to restore confidence in U.S. alliances, whether with NATO or with our alliances with Japan and Korea, Australia, and others. And I think he's done a relatively good job of that on the security side. And I think it's an interesting indicator that both Sweden and Finland, which are countries serious about their security, wanted to join NATO. So I think that has drawn countries together. I think Russia's attack on Ukraine was a shock, as you know, in Germany. Germany was relying on energy resources from Russia. I think Germany has quite effectively had an energy transition that people surprised how skillful it's been able to handle that. I think whether Germany has totally overcome the pacifism that's developed over the past 20 years, I think is an open question. I referred to the holiday from history, and I'm not sure that this is still filtered through the German commitment to increase its defense spending by about 100 billion euro, I think is real. But to make it work, you're going to also have to change a whole series of things in terms of procurement and long-term budget projections that, as you know, are partly caught up in coalition politics. On the negative side, I guess I would say that I'm a little worried about the Franco-German relationship. Traditionally, that is kind of the driver for European cohesion. And I think that Chancellor Scholz is the first chancellor I've known that doesn't have that emotional tie. There's always been differences between Paris and Berlin or Bonn. And then on the not so good side, I'm obviously not a big fan of US protectionist economic policies. And I don't support the idea that I've heard from the Biden administration that says, well, as we subsidize industries, Europe's response should be to subsidize industries. You see the tiff we're still having over steel and sort of aluminum. And so where I fault the Biden administration is not on its alliance and security policy. I think its problem has been on its international economic policy. And this is true in East Asia as well as in the case of Europe. And coming back to your observation about developing countries, they're the ones that are really left out on this. Europe would have a hard enough time subsidizing, but if you're in Africa or Latin America or many developing countries, you have no chance of doing this. And so I hope the Biden administration will eventually return to some of its notion of the benefits of an open economy and trade, but I wouldn't expect that before the election.
Thanks. Do you feel that the China policy of Europe and the United States could diverge much more so than seems to be the case right now?
I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine and some of the behavior that I referenced under Xi Jinping has changed some of the European thinking about China. And you've seen this in terms of even within the German business community. Frankly, my sense is that some of the big companies will still want to have their platforms in China. Some of the Mittelstand are now feeling more threatened, and that sort of undermines it. But on the other hand, as I've said, I'm not a full believer in the way that the Trump or Biden administration have approached China either. And so this is a good example of where alliances work best is if we share perspectives and try to figure out how to cooperate together. And in that sense, I think the US and Europe have more in common than other parties, along with Japan and the democracies of East Asia. And frankly, I would go beyond the democracies here. This is whether it's developing countries or other parties, I think we need to continue to expand the coalition of opportunity and openness in societies, which I hope the United States and Europe can stand for.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's turn to some questions from the audience. And we have got a question from Thomas Schwartz of Vanderbilt University. He asks, given the current role of Iran in challenging the United States in the Middle East, what do you think should be America's policy towards the Islamic Republic?
Well, first, I'm delighted that Thomas Schwartz is listening in. He and I have corresponded recently. He wrote an excellent book I just read about McCloy and Germany after World War II. So he's another of your fraternity of diplomatic historians. As I say, Professor Schwartz, I think that Iran is a spoiler in the system. And I think in dealing with Iran, we not only have to think about the potential nuclear weapon, but we also have to think about the sort of Iranian use of militias in different countries to destabilize its neighbors. And therefore, while I understand the Obama administration's effort to try to cap the nuclear program, I think it was a fundamental misjudgment unless you dealt with the behavior of Iran to try to destabilize the region. And to bring us back to the story of Germany in 1889 and 90, I used the conventional forces arms negotiation. I think it's important to think arms negotiations within the context of regional security. You have to combine the two together. I have a chapter in my book about the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, where where Charles Evans Hughes used the naval arms control as part of a establishment of a security system for East Asia when the United States had failed to pass enact the Versailles Treaty. Similarly, my point in the case of Iran is I think one needs to not just think about arms control, but thinks about the regional security arrangement. And so I believe that we frankly, using the example with China, had been on a relatively good path when we were able to get others to help us quarantine or isolate Iran. That period is now gone. But we'll also see changes, I think, in Iran's internal politics, so we have to be somewhat patient.
Thanks very much. Here's a question by Linda Sanders, and she says, is there resistance to funding for Ukraine, which we currently see in both houses of Congress, and which mostly comes from members of the Republican Party? It has had more to do with they playing their domestic constituencies rather than a real conviction that Ukraine should not receive any more money.
Well, domestic politics is always important in foreign policy. And I think what those members are reflecting is what I've heard from some politicians on the campaign trail, which is that people have their own economic anxieties at home. And so Ukraine seems like a very far off place. And so they're wondering, well, why should we continue to pour billions of dollars into it? So I think, yes, they're reflecting the politics. As I said, however, if you look at most of the polling numbers, you still have, I don't know, 60% support for funding Ukraine. It's still rather large in both the houses. But what it got tied up with was the fact that the Republican caucus in the House, that has a very small majority, couldn't pass it on its own. And therefore, it was tied up in this battle you've seen with the Republican leadership. I saw in the news today that Senator McConnell, the leader in the Republicans in the Senate, has been very supportive of this funding. Just said that he thought that Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, would be open to the idea. So I think this will move forward, but I think the message is one can't take these types of support for granted, which goes back to one reason why a year ago I started to think about trying to use the $300 billion of frozen Russian reserves. You know, in my policy experience, it's rare that you can find an issue that is good politics, good policy, good strategically, and good ethically. This one checks all boxes. So I've been trying to push parties to move forward on it.
Thank you. We've got a question from Brent Hart. He's a member of the State Department. He says, if we pressure Ukraine to give up territory, isn't that what Chamberlain did in the 1930s? Isn't that the same approach? And wouldn't Putin interpret that as a huge victory? Would that be the right lesson to tell the world, to show the world?
Well, first off, I didn't say we should press. I was trying to say you have to define what is your strategic objective. And if the State Department's strategic objective is not only to preserve Ukraine's democracy, its economy, its independence and sovereignty, but to regain all the territory, including Crimea, I think you've set a very ambitious objective. And I hope the State Department has some sense of what we used to call realism, which is matching sort of means and ends. So I'm trying to be realistic here. And what I would suggest would be at some point, the Ukrainians may themselves, the Ukrainians are growing weary here. And at some point, the Ukrainians themselves may decide they want to try to reach some settlement, in which case I hope the United States can work with other parties to help them achieve the strategic objective. As for your historical analogy, it goes back to where Klaus and I started. I think you have to be very careful about the uses of historical analogies. I don't think your historical analogy of Munich fits at all. And I think the situations are not at all historically comparable. So I hope they teach some history at the State Department.
Well, to be fair, I brought in the name of Chamberlain. That wasn't actually mentioned in the question. He said the peace to our times approach, but which is similar. Anyway, we have a related question, and it's an anonymous attendee, and he or she says, in 2008, we did nothing when Putin invaded Georgia and took some of the Georgian territory. In 2014, the Western world did nothing regarding Crimea. Did we not encourage Putin's behavior of a bully by not doing anything at that time?
I think this is always the risk. It's why after 2014, I think the United States should have done more to try to prepare Ukraine, but it looks like perhaps quietly there was more done than we expected because Ukraine was able to fight off Russia more effectively than most people expected. But the realistic challenge is, so what were you going to do? Were we going to defend Georgia? Are you willing to have American men and women fight for Georgian security? Are you willing to have them fight for Ukraine? We've just spent 10 minutes discussing how it's hard to get money, much less put their lives on the line. Those are the realistic decisions you have to face in foreign policy. I remember being in meetings that President Bush 43 had with the Georgian president, Zoellick, and Bush was warning. He said, don't press Putin too hard. Don't push this too far, because he has a lot of animosity towards you, and he may try to take retribution, and you're going to have to, he's basically saying, you know, the US will try to be supportive, but we're not going to come to your aid. So yes, that's one of the challenges of foreign policy security. It doesn't always fit according to what we ideally would like, but we try to make it as practically secure as we can. All the more reason, I would say, why it's important to help Ukraine defend itself now, and why also to strengthen the US military so it has the ability to have deterrence, not only in dealing with Iran, but also with China.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back a little bit to contemporary history and the year 2000, when Arafat rejected the Israeli offer of an independent Palestinian state. Was the rejection justified, and was that a missed opportunity?
I'm sorry, I did say, who did you say?
David Cedar asked, I read the question, why did Arafat reject the Israeli offer in 2000? Was the rejection justified or not?
I'm not close enough to those negotiations, or frankly, to all the history of Middle East politics, to make sure I can give you a good answer. The traditional sort of, I think, explanation that would be given you by the Middle East negotiators is that the Palestinian leaders, whether sort of Arafat or Abbas, have always had uncertain political legitimacy at home. And therefore, they're wary of accepting agreements unless they can get strong support from some of the other key Arab countries. And I think the question in the negotiations at the end of the Clinton administration or in 2000 was whether the Palestinian leaders could have gotten support from the Saudis and other actors. And frankly, I think these are missed opportunities, and the Palestinian people are paying the price for it.
Thank you. Here's a question by Mirek Hosman. He asks about the future of multilateral organizations such as the World Bank. Do they have a future? And what is your advice to the new World Bank president?
Well, I'm having dinner with the new World Bank president tonight, so I'll tell him directly. But I hope the multilateral institutions have a very important role. And in fact, given the fragmentation and the fracturing that we've had in the international system, I think in some ways their role could be more important than ever, because they can provide sometimes neutral ground for cooperative efforts among the major powers to deal with some of the international economic challenges, and as they also relate to some of the political and security challenges. Having said that, I think we now have two very good heads of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva and Ajay Banga at the World Bank. I think they're both knowledgeable, informed leaders. One has more experience in the public sector, one more in the private sector. So I think there's an opportunity. But these institutions are only as strong as their supporters. So the Biden administration has actually proposed trying to strengthen some of the financial resources of the World Bank. That's a good thing. I'm trying to help them to be able to do so. And whether the issues are Africa, Ukrainian reconstruction, whether there are questions of climate, a lot of the developing countries, as we've sort of touched on, are the ones that are now most vulnerable in this system. And yet, whether they are low-income countries or middle-income countries, they're going to be critical for the success of an international order. People will often talk in rather sort of cosmic terms about a new Bretton Woods or different international orders. Frankly, I don't think that's the way the system works. The way the system works is to try to come up with pragmatic solutions to problems. So you mentioned, Klaus, I was president of the World Bank at the time of the global financial crisis. In addition to a lot of financial support for developing countries, we had a big surge in food prices, and we worked particularly with the UN on some of the food price issues. A lot of the bank supervisors started to restrict the bankers' role in trade finance, and that was going to hurt a lot of the developing countries. So we had to work with the bank supervisors to make sure the liquidity didn't dry up for trade finance. A number of the Central and Eastern European countries had banks that were based in Western Europe, and they started to pull all the capital back. So I worked with the EBRD and some of the other parties in Europe to try to make sure we help restore some of their capital. That's the practical work that has to be done for these developing country institutions.
Thanks. Here's a question by Stuart Kaplan about China. Has Xi Jinping's resort to nationalism and the inflaming of nationalism in China made it or give him less of a choice than to do something militarily about Taiwan, never mind China's long-term interest as a nation?
Yes, I think it's a combination of his restoring what he thinks is the power of the Communist Party with Chinese nationalism. So I gave you one anecdote from 2012, and let me share with you another one. In 2012, when Xi took office, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union. And that film had been shown, and he ordered all the party cadres to see it. If that film had been developed in Europe, Gorbachev, of course, would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, not so much the Chinese version. In the Chinese version, Gorbachev was the fool who abandoned the Communist Party and led to the breakup of his country and ruin. And the not so subtle message is, it's not going to happen here. So in discussing China, I'm not naive about the efforts he's made with the Communist Party. Part of the Communist Party's legitimacy is, after a century of weakness, they have tried to restore Chinese territory and strength, and that since 1949. And some of that plays on the nationalism you referred to, some of it plays on the territorial issues that you've seen with Hong Kong or Macau or sort of other areas that they believe were taken from China during the century of humiliation, and that definitely relates to the Taiwan issue. It also relates to Nepal and Xizang province. So yes, I think that that's a limiting factor. At the same time, I think as we think about our long-term interests with China, we need to try to keep seeing whether there's potential for change in China. I don't think Xi Jinping will be the last word on China. At some point, he will pass on. Frankly, one of the concerns that I have is that a lot of the Chinese that came to the United States or Europe or Japan or Australia for 40 years did build ties and developed an affection and a sense of what open societies are a lot about. A lot of those Chinese are now having to pull back. But if Xi's approaches seems to be not working so well and he passes from the scene, there may be another round on this. So history sort of moves over time. And so I think we should play to our strengths, not try to imitate China. So the idea that we should have an industrial policy like China, to me, is foolhardy. We should emphasize our strengths, which are openness to ideas, to goods, to people, to capital. Hence, I'm against the protectionism. I think we should be open to talented people who want to immigrate to our countries. The demographics in China are horrible. They're much better in the United States and could be better in North America if we treat people as a resource. So this is one of the fundamental strategic choices we have to make in dealing with China. So I believe we need to have a certain security deterrence, which I think Biden has helped reestablish with our allies. Also, in a sense, a complex relationship with India. I don't think we've invested enough in the military that we're going to need to be able to have in the region, but we should also play the long game. We don't have to move towards confrontation on every issue.
Thank you. A related question by Admiral Dennis Blair. Dennis Blair is now a professor at UNC-Chapel Hill, and he's, of course, President Obama's Director of National Intelligence. He is asking, is the economic decoupling between the United States and its friends and allies and China in a high-tech area significant? Can or should it be changed?
I think it is significant, Admiral Blair. Nevertheless, there's still a large volume of trade. It's about $700 billion of trade in other areas. I don't think that the tariffs that the Trump administration put on and with China's retaliated were effective for either party. They didn't achieve the goals that Trump allegedly wanted to sort of pursue. In the tech area, as you know, this gets technical quite quickly. I think it's understandable that the United States will want to limit certain technology for high-end uses of the Chinese military. The question is, how far do you expand that? And what does it do to your own industries? So one of the questions now for US semiconductor firms is that get about 20 to 25% of their revenues from China. If we cut that off, what does that do to their strength? So I think this is where the devil's in the details of the fine tuning. The administration has sort of stated, well, we want to have high walls and a narrow field. That sounds nice conceptually. The danger, as you know, Admiral Blair, is in government, these things tend to expand and you start to include more and more items.
Thank you. And loyal Krasno supporter Brian Kilev says that the United States wants to export democracy, but has serious democracy problems at home. What are we doing about that?
Well, I agree with that. I think that the basic, the United States is most effective if we do things well at home. And frankly, I think the example that we set is the best thing we can do while trying to promote more open societies. Historically, the United States system has a lot of resilience. I mean, I grew up in 1968. I saw the events where we had the killing of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, riots, the problems in Vietnam, other issues. I think what distinguishes this period, and which does give me concern, is that the democratic system has a way to self-correct if people accept the results of elections. I've been through a lot of elections. So I've been a policy person. I've also been in elections and in recounts. And if a party loses, eventually it has to realize it can't blame the voter. It has to blame itself. So I think the most dangerous aspects from Trump and those that continue to support his denial of elections is the fact of not accepting the democratic result. And all I can say is that I and probably many others on this call took an oath to the Constitution. We ought to keep it.
Thank you. Doctoral student Pasud asks a question that he sees a worrying tendency that the American public is not interested in foreign policy anymore. And I think that also applies to much of the rest of the Western world. What can we do about it to tell people actually foreign policy matters, not just domestic politics?
This is always a challenge. I mean, this is a big country. I find the reverse somewhat interesting. I was speaking to a group of people from Central Asia yesterday. And as some of your questions have revealed, Klaus, there's the idea of, is the US doing too much for Israel? Is it dominating this, dominating that? I tried to warn them, look, be careful what you ask for. A lot of people in the United States are quite content here, and maybe they don't necessarily feel that every problem in the world has to be theirs. And so maybe the United States will pull back on these issues. Ultimately, it requires political leadership at the presidential, congressional level. I think on the positive side is that if you look at some of the polls from the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and others, the American people understand their interactions with the world. They actually are positive about trade much more than some of the protectionists are in Congress. They don't want to get into a conflict with China. They by and large want to support their allies and Ukraine. But obviously, they need to deal with their own domestic anxieties about dealing with change economically and socially. And frankly, this is where in the US system, the president plays a very unique role. And as the prior question suggested, I think the Trump era has still been a destabilizing aspect in the United States as well as abroad. But, and you saw this even in the immediate aftermath of World War II with Robert Taft and the critical role that Eisenhower played in taking the Republican nomination. So in a way to combine the answers to these two questions, Klaus, informed citizens have to take part in the debate. They have to vote. They have to be politically active. They have to stand up for what's right. And they have to try to shape public opinion on these issues. That's the nature of democracy. So we started out with a little reference to my book. One of my themes in the book was that foreign policy in the United States always depends on congressional and political support. I worked for 8 years for James Baker. He was very effective as a Secretary of State, White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury, but he also had his eye on political support. And just to give you one example, in the Gulf War, when we worked with the UN Security Council to get a resolution of supporting it in 1990, one of the ideas in Baker's mind was if we got support from the UN Security Council, it would make it harder for the US Senate to oppose. And I think the Senate vote was only 52 to 48, it was quite close. But so he had in mind that how those two actions would be combined. And just to connect us with China, of course, we got the Chinese at least not to veto it, to sort of, we wanted their support, but that's one of the aspects of diplomacy, even after Tiananmen Square, is how you're going to work with other countries to maintain your global coalition.
Thanks very much. We are coming to the end of our time. If I may, I will ask you 2 or 3 more questions before we end it. And I don't want to exhaust you too much. You have really asked and answered our question in a very detailed and informative way. Christian Forsner of the Seidel Foundation here in Washington, he asked, could the West have done something differently? Could the West have stopped Putin invading Ukraine? And also perhaps in that context, talk to us about the future of Europe.
Well, from the Seidel Foundation, I said, let the two of you talk about the future of Europe. You're Europeans. But I'll answer it this way. It's a good question whenever you have a terrible event like the invasion of Ukraine happen, you wonder if you could have somehow prevented it. As I've suggested, I think some of this traces back to Putin, his view of history, his view of Russia, his view of the place in Russian history. So I'm not sure that it could have been stopped, absent our willingness to sort of directly defend Ukraine, which I don't think our publics are willing to do. And so I think that much of the credit, of course, has to be due here to President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. I think it was a near-run thing early on. I think if Zelensky had left, who knows, I think Ukraine would have fought, but I think the cohesion would have been lost. So while we've been talking about Ukraine in the larger context, we need to keep in mind the Ukrainians are the ones who are putting their lives on the line here. As for the connection with Europe, I'll link the two issues. I think, as I said, my strategic objective for Europe, or for Ukraine, democratic, sovereign, independent, healthy economy, connected to the European Union. The European Union has said it wants to bring Ukraine as a member. Anybody who knows the European Union knows that is a huge step. That will require not only transformation in Ukraine, but it's going to require transformation within the European Union. How many commissioners you have, the voting system, the budget support. And so I think the question about the future of Europe really will partly be driven by the European approach to Ukraine. And so the starting point now is to try to help Ukrainians defend themselves, to be successful if we can, try to reach some settlement that allows Ukraine to prosper as a democracy. But then the bigger questions will be, how will Europeans themselves want to change the structure of the European Union? As I also referenced, in my experience, it's very hard to see that happening without some alignment between France and Germany. France and Germany alone can't do it. In fact, others will be sensitive if they try to. But if France and Germany are not looking in the same direction, I don't think the issue will move sideways. So in that context, as in the end of the Cold War, I hope the United States can be supportive of what Europeans decide, because our common interests far exceed the frictions and differences.
Thank you. Perhaps one final question from the audience, and I will then ask you the very final question, if I may. Michael Hopkins from Liverpool in the UK, he is wondering about China's ability to bring that Iranian-Saudi deal about recently. Was that a big event? Was that, and that is now in my own words, is that kind of China's coming out as a global player?
I agree with the Biden administration. I forget whether it was Jake Sullivan or the Secretary of State that said that's something the U.S. should welcome. We want to try to lower the tensions in the Persian Gulf. There are various accounts of who played the key role and to what degree the parties themselves or Oman were sort of ready for that step. But frankly, that's the type of action, as I mentioned, with China to try to achieve some security and stability in the Middle East that should be in our common interest, just as it would be with Russia. So I would encourage China to play that role. And at the same time, sometimes there's a zero-sum logic that if China is successful in peace and stability, that we're sometimes hurt. I don't have that view. It's a big world. There's lots of problems out there. Remember, I gave the speech about China becoming a responsible stakeholder. If China can act responsibly and help the international economy, help deal with developing countries with their debt, help push a peaceful settlement with Russia, I think that's all a plus. Look, again, I don't want to overemphasize the likelihood of this. I think there's various reasons that Xi will, as we've mentioned, will play his cards in a different way. But we shouldn't foreclose it and take, for example, the Chinese pressure on Russia about use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. You remember a few months ago, that was a point of high anxiety, and all of a sudden China said, well, we think this should be set off the table. Well, I think that's a good step.
Thank you. You are a moderate Republican or non-Trumpist Republican, I take it. How would you evaluate President Biden's and his team's foreign policy? And then, of course, I have to ask the question which is asked in the rest of the world. Is President Biden too old for a second term, or doesn't it really matter at all?
Well, on the second one, those will be for the American voter to decide. I sort of am disappointed that the two leading candidates are people who I think should both be in retirement, and that we should be moving to a younger generation. But this is the way that politics are working out. And as you suggest, I think a re-election of Donald Trump would be a disaster for us as well as others. So that's the card. You have to play the cards you're dealt. As for the Biden administration on foreign policy, I'll answer it in two ways. First, as I've suggested, I think the restoration of alliances in the Pacific and the Atlantic after the Trump era have been constructive. I think the protectionism in the international economic policies have been destructive. And in a sense, if you look at the US trade policy, it's particularly unfortunate because it basically affirms Trump's protectionism. And once you have it from two parties, then that starts to build into the body politic. I'm doing an event tomorrow with the Cato Institute where they're trying to make the case for globalization, trying to rebuild sort of political support for openness in American trade, and that's something we'll have to do as a country. I think in terms of the style of foreign policy, for some of those part of this call who are sort of students of it, it's important to remember that Biden is a creature of the Senate. I mean, that's where he built his career. And I think you can see evidence of that in his foreign policy. And just to start, most senators, remember, they're not executives. They're not responsible for thinking about day 2 or 3 or 4. They tend to have a reactive foreign policy. They'll often react to events. They're used to stating a position on events. And I think if you look at Biden's foreign policy, it has tended to be more reactive because of that. And if you look at the key people around President Biden, in some ways, it's like an extended Senate staff. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was his staff director. Jake Sullivan, which I think is stretched in various ways, came from the campaign team, and in some ways, I think originally worked on the domestic policy side. He's playing a role a little different than our national security advisors have played. I think the Defense Secretary, Austin, is trying, in a sense, he's the anti-Petraeus. And what I mean by that is that Biden wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. He wanted to pull back from military conflicts. Austin was a credible leader, but not somebody that would challenge him on those issues. While I have a personal like for Secretary Yellen, I think she's more of a central banker than she is driving the international economic foreign policy in the ways that I've sort of mentioned. So in that sense, it's kind of a Senate staff. On the positive side, Biden reflects the institutional culture that he has lived in for 20 or 30 years. He's pro-alliances. He has an empathy towards people, which is demonstrated in his relations with Europeans and in the case of Israel, perhaps with Asia as well. And that's a plus in the relationship. So no administration gets everything right. I think so far they've been trying to sort of repair some of the downsides with the Trump administration. I just worry a little bit about 2 things. One, the international economic side and the protectionism. And I think, as you and I discussed, the deficit spending industrial policy is not going to turn out so well. And I think they need a few more action officers to sort of move on some of these issues that I've talked about. Because in a sense, you've got a staff team around Biden, and there's only so much that any president, particularly one his age, can do.
What is missing is a George Kennan and a Bob Zoellick. Is that what you say?
No, I think a Kennan was more of a intellectual and policy making. It's missing more of a Jim Baker or Henry Kissinger.
All right. We will let Joe know. Maybe he will listen to us. And my very final question to you tonight is, when is your next book coming out? What about your memoirs, for example?
Well, I've actually started a book about the world economy. And I'm trying, as I did with this first book, to draw on some experience in history and try to explain for non-economists how the world economy works and how it doesn't work, and sort of interconnecting the dots of topics that are otherwise seen as separate: trade, exchange rates and international money, development, energy security, climate change. But I'm afraid I'm still a good year off from that because it's hard to find time, as you know, to do your writing.
I very much do know. And we all look forward to that book. We will certainly read it. But tell me about your memoirs. When are they coming?
I have no plans for that, I'm afraid.
Most politicians, most policymakers do in the end. So perhaps think about it as a lesson from the Krasno series. Bob Zoellick, thank you very much for your very detailed and informative performance today. You answered all our many questions. We had a very interesting conversation. I very much enjoyed the dialogue. So thanks very much for taking the time. And hopefully we will be able to welcome you back to our lecture series. What about that?
Well, first we have to get through Halloween.
I'm sure. Thanks very much to everyone. And thanks very much to all our audience. And I'll see you again in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Good night. Thank you for joining us tonight.